Man saves a drowning fox. You won't believe what happens next. The splashing sounds from the concrete storm drain were wrong somehow. Too irregular and desperate to be just rushing water from the overnight rains that had transformed the usually quiet Riverside Park into a network of temporary rivers and flooded channels. Tom Rodriguez had been maintaining these grounds for 12 years, long enough to recognize when the autumn storms had created more than just puddles and soggy walkways. But the frantic thrashing echoing from beneath the metal grate suggested something far more urgent than debris blockage. When Tom knelt beside the drain and lifted the heavy cover, his heart sank at the sight below. A red fox, her normally vibrant russet coat darkened to burnt amber by the muddy water, was fighting a losing battle against the current that threatened to sweep her toward the underground culvert system. Her delicate paws scrambled for purchase against the smooth concrete walls, claws scraping uselessly against surfaces designed to channel water, not provide escape routes for desperate wildlife. The fox's condition told a story of exhaustion and mounting panic. Her bushy tail, usually carried with the proud confidence of a successful predator, now dragged heavy with water behind her as she paddled frantically to keep her head above the surface. Each breath came in quick, shallow gasps between the waves that lapped at her muzzle, and her dark eyes held the wild desperation of an animal who understood that her strength was failing against an enemy she could not bite or outrun. Tom's mind raced through the implications of what he was witnessing. The storm drain system had been designed for the lighter rains of previous decades, before climate change had made these autumn deluges increasingly common and severe. What should have been a shallow channel offering temporary shelter for small animals had become a concrete-lined river, flowing fast enough to trap even creatures as agile and intelligent as urban foxes. The water level had risen throughout the night, probably catching the fox while she sheltered from the storm, transforming her refuge into a prison. Her repeated attempts to climb the steep walls had clearly been going on for hours, evidenced by the way her movements had become more labored and less coordinated as exhaustion set in. The current was relentless, constantly pulling her toward the dark mouth of the drainage tunnel that would carry her underground into a maze she could never navigate back to daylight. Could see that the fox's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Her paddling had become more erratic, and twice in the few minutes he had been watching, her head had dipped below the surface before she managed to force herself back up. The cold October water was sapping what remained of her strength, and the smooth concrete offered no natural handholds that might allow her to rest even briefly from her exhausting fight against the current. "Hold on there, girl," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the rush of water through the channel. The fox's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, but she lacked the energy to lift her head fully above the waterline to investigate this new presence in her rapidly shrinking world. Tom's first challenge was getting into the drainage channel without frightening the already panicked fox into making a desperate attempt to escape that could prove fatal. The concrete walls were steep and slippery from the constant flow of water, requiring him to lower himself carefully using the metal rungs built into the side of the storm drain for maintenance access. Each movement had to be deliberate and slow, telegraphing his intentions to an animal whose survival instincts were screaming warnings about the approaching human presence. The fox's reaction to his descent was immediate and heartbreaking. Her exhausted paddling intensified briefly as primitive fear overrode even her desperate need for help. But her weakened condition meant that this burst of energy lasted only seconds before she was forced to return to the more economical movements that had been keeping her alive. Her dark eyes tracked Tom's progress with the hyper-alertness of prey species, but there was something else in that gaze. A flicker of assessment that suggested intelligence weighing options against an increasingly hopeless situation. The water was colder than Tom had expected, reaching nearly to his waist as he waded carefully toward the struggling animal. The current tugged insistently at his legs, and he could feel the smooth algae coating the concrete floor, making each step treacherous. The fox was perhaps 6 feet away when he paused, understanding that the next few moments would determine whether this rescue succeeded or became another tragedy to add to the storm's toll. Close up, the fox's condition was even more dire than it had appeared from above. Her normally lustrous coat was matted and heavy with the brown water that carried debris from across the park's drainage system. Exhaustion had dulled the bright intelligence that should have sparkled in her amber eyes, replaced by the glazed look of an animal operating purely on survival instinct. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, each exhalation visible in small puffs in the cool morning air. Tom extended his hand slowly, palm up, allowing the fox to process his presence without feeling cornered or threatened. Wild animals, even in extremis, retained the potential for panic-driven actions that could injure both rescuer and rescued. The fox's ears flattened briefly against her skull, but she lacked the energy for flight and seemed to understand, on some level, that the approaching human represented her only remaining option for survival. The actual rescue required a delicate balance of firmness and gentleness that Tom had learned through years of helping creatures who found themselves trapped by human infrastructure. He slipped his hands beneath the fox's body, supporting her chest and hindquarters, while being careful not to restrict her breathing or trigger her natural instinct to struggle. Her weight was surprisingly light. She was smaller than she had appeared while fighting the current. Probably a young female not yet fully grown. The fox's response to being lifted was a testament to her exhausted state. Instead of the frantic struggling Tom had prepared for, she went nearly limp in his grasp, her head resting against his forearm, as if acknowledging that her fate was now entirely in his hands. Her rapid breathing began to slow slightly as the relief of no longer fighting the current allowed some tension to leave her small frame. "That's it, little one," Tom whispered, as he began the careful process of carrying her toward the drainage ladder. Almost safe now. The climb out of the channel was treacherous with his precious cargo, but the fox remained still, seeming to understand that cooperation was essential to their mutual success in escaping the concrete trap that had nearly claimed her life. The moment Tom set the rescued fox on solid ground beside the flooded drainage system, he expected her to disappear into the underbrush with the swift grace that had made her species legendary for survival. Instead, the exhausted animal did something that stopped him completely. She turned away from the obvious escape routes and began moving with urgent, unsteady steps toward a dense thicket of brambles and fallen logs 20 meters away, pausing every few strides to look back at him with eyes that held unmistakable desperation. Tom found himself following without fully understanding why, drawn by something in the fox's behavior that spoke to a purpose beyond simple recovery from her ordeal. Her movements were still weak from the prolonged struggle in the water, but there was undeniable determination in the way she picked her path through the flood debris, as if she was being called toward something that mattered more than her own exhaustion or wariness of human presence. The thicket she approached had become a temporary island in the expanded landscape of floodwater, raised just enough above the surrounding terrain to remain dry, while everything around it had been claimed by the storm's overflow. As they drew closer, Tom began to hear the sounds that explained everything, the high-pitched mewing calls of very young animals, voices so small and desperate they could barely be heard above the background noise of rushing water and settling debris. The fox quickened her pace despite her obvious fatigue, disappearing into the tangled branches with the single-minded focus of a mother responding to her offspring's distress. Tom followed carefully, pushing aside the wet foliage to discover 3 tiny fox cubs huddled together in a hollow beneath an overturned tree trunk, their eyes still closed with youth and their rust-colored fur damp from the humid air trapped in their refuge. The reunion was immediate and profound. The mother fox settled among her babies with visible relief, her body curving protectively around the small forms that pressed against her warmth with urgent mewing sounds. Tom realized he was witnessing the end of a story that had begun hours earlier, when rising floodwaters had separated this family and trapped the mother on the wrong side of what had become an impassable barrier of rushing water. "You never gave up on them," Tom whispered, understanding now why the fox had fought so desperately against the current that should have swept her away the afternoon. Light filtered through the brambles as the reunited family settled into their temporary sanctuary, 4 russet forms silhouetted against the green shadows in a tableau of devotion that would remain with Tom long after the floodwaters receded and the park returned to its peaceful rhythms.